In November 2020, Zambia succumbed to the weight of a $42.5 million Eurobond repayment by becoming the first African nation to default on its debt in the COVID-19 era. And now its total public debt stock has climbed to $32.8 billion, including interest arrears at the end of last year, of which $18.6 billion was external. At the end of June 2022, its total debt, including interest arrears, was $32.5 billion, with $17.5 billion in external debts. Zambia has been looking to restructure its debt after becoming the first African country to default during the pandemic era, that is from late 2020. Zambia's Ministry of Finance said in an accompanying statement that the nation urgently needs a significant reduction in its debt burden. Zambia enjoys productive and positive relationships with all its creditors and is hopeful that an agreement on debt restructuring can be reached swiftly. So what is the situation with Africa's largest copper producer? And to answer this question and all other questions that we have this morning, we have Cheelo, economist and research fellow, Southern African Institute for Policy and Research from Lusaka, Zambia. Thank you so much, Caesar, for joining this discussion.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, now, debt is something many nations share in common. Economists will say that when it comes to financing government, when it comes to paying certain arrears, when it comes to different types of government expenditure, it is necessary for governments to look for funds, whether within or outside, to fund these expenses. But then I'd like to know how well this money is being borrowed by Zambia has been utilized by the previous administration and this current administration.
Sure, thanks so much. Well, in terms of the previous administration, I think the use was pretty questionable. And some of the reasons are there were no borrowing plans. Compliance with the legal requirements to borrow were very weak. Compliance with things like the Financial Management, Public Financial Management Act. Things like project appraisals were not done. The publishing of debt statistics was not done. Loans, in many cases, were very poorly negotiated, and we took on a lot of private commercial debts, which changed fundamentally the structure of our debt as a country. Fast forward to the new administration, I think things are much better because now there's a legally binding borrowing plan that the Ministry of Finance has to put in place every year. The macro targets are very clear and realistic in the national budget. Compliance with the law is on track, so no unauthorized borrowing, no pipeline debt coming through that way. I think the team at the Ministry of Finance and at the central bank is very strong and are leading the charge on the debt restructuring that you mentioned a moment ago. So things are looking up much better than they were in the previous administration.
All right, you're saying that things are looking better in terms of Zambia's debt, but then depending on source, at the end of January, Zambia's foreign debt may be as high as $17 billion or as low as $15 billion. So now that you're saying things are a bit stable, is there a probability that Zambia might be taking on more loans?
Absolutely. I mean, for any country, loans are a necessity. And the issue, really, the point is, are those loans planned for and programmable? Are they justified? So, for example, if we look in the 2023 budget for Zambia, the plan or the target was to run a fiscal deficit of 7.7% of GDP. If Zambia's GDP is roughly around 23 billion, it means financing the deficit through borrowing was to the tune of about $1.7 billion in 2023. So borrowing is a necessity and is something that is happening even in the Zambian economy, despite the fact that Zambia is currently in default on external debt service.
All right. In November 2020, Zambia's central bank governor said that the country could have paid $42.5 million towards its Eurobond liabilities, but it chose not to. So what are the reasons that led to the reversal in that decision?
Well, I think the main point was it's probably true that Zambia was capable of paying making that particular payment. But I think the point is for a prolonged period before November 2022, Zambia was in significant debt distress. So struggling to raise enough money to settle all the domestic bills, settle all the other bills in the balance of payments, things like bills on imports of goods and services. And on top of that, to contend with debt service, which was a big ticket item. So that debt distress, in my view, is really what led to Zambia coming to a standstill. At some point, you could only kick the can so far down the road before something gave way. And for Zambia, I think it happened in November 2020. But before that, there were a few incidences of default that were maybe not so highly publicized. For example, with the Africa Development Bank, they were managed privately between the Zambian government and the bank. But those were defaults, and they were showing fractures within the debt system because of the huge debt overhang, the commercial nature of a big part of the debt, and the debt distress that had come with it. I mean, the ability of Zambia to service its debt based on economic performance had waned over the years. And that was the main, I think, pressure point that eventually caused Zambia to hold back, to stand still on paying its external debt obligations, despite the fact that they might have had some extra resources to pay one or two additional points. They couldn't just keep kicking the can down the road.
Now, the nation, as we hear it, is said to be annoyed by the delays in its debt restructuring with the U.S. and members of the G7 said to be worried over China's hold-up in rescheduling debt for developing nations. And of course, this is also showing some sort of drawback on the process that Zambia is hoping to achieve within a particular frame. But then, is there any merit rather to this particular claim? And if so, why is it that China is lagging behind when it comes to agreeing to this discussion process?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is any process like this is informed by roughly three things. One is the information at hand by the person who's making a particular comment. And two is the perspective of that person. And three is the wider sort of geopolitical tension. So in terms of information, I think it's in the public domain that the G20 framework that was being used to negotiate the bulk of Zambia's debt in terms of debt treatment or restructuring was discovered along the way to have weaknesses. For example, how do you treat multilateral debt? How do you treat domestic debt? Those were questions that emerged as the framework was being utilized. And naturally, with a predator that is heavily exposed in Zambia as well as globally, the Chinese had to be a lot more cautious than anyone else in figuring out what those implications of, for lack of a better phrase, selective treatment of Zambia's debt. So the Eurobond debt was supposed to get some sort of restructuring. The bilateral debt with China was supposed to get some sort of restructuring. But what about the other pockets of debt that I was mentioning? So that question emerged, and that gave a different nature to the negotiations, and people had to go back to the drawing board and say, yes, this is a valid question. How do we treat it? So the information that was at hand then changed. I think the perspectives also change. For Western societies, I think there's a lot of sort of public show in the way negotiations will go. There's a lot of sort of transparency. But negotiations can follow two parallel tracks. In one case, the creditors and the debtors might want to discuss things behind closed doors, because debts are actually driven by contracts. They're founded on contracts, and contracts are sort of, until they're sanctioned by law to be disclosed, are a private affair. So some arrangements lend themselves to easy transparency. Other arrangements, the negotiators like to keep the cards close to their chest, so to speak, so that they are able to manage the negotiation without too much publicity. So I suspect, and this is just an individual view, I suspect that China, like many Eastern partners to Zambia, would be a bit hesitant to do the negotiation in an open sort of public space, and would rather be to lessen the publicity around that. Whereas the Western inclined countries, driven by things like social media, mainstream media, openness and transparency, would want the debt negotiations to be as open as possible to the public. So I think Zambia's job is to see how it draws the balances between the preferences of the different creditors that it has across the table from it.
But then, even as China tries to be cautious and coy in terms of the modalities surrounding the debt restructuring process, we are aware that the length of such a process can take between a few months to several years, and time is ticking out for Zambia because there is a timeline, there is a deadline. So how would Zambia's economy and fiscal policies be affected if this process continues to linger for a longer period than expected?
Well, there's definitely pressure on the Zambian economy from that. I mean, one of the pressure points is naturally that as people continue to observe the situation, elements like foreign direct investment, portfolio investment from foreign financial institutions into government bills and bonds, they sometimes stay on the fence and may even exit the market. So as they do that, you find a shortage of foreign exchange that is available for Zambia to then settle its international obligations on imports and things like this. And that has a knock-on effect in terms of weakening the local currency, something that has been observed in the Zambian case since the start of this year. A part of the weakening of the local currency, the underlying factor to that is the protracted debt negotiation. So it does have potentially difficult effects. And you have to remember that the longer the debt negotiation goes on, the more these arrears and on interest payments and so on accumulate. And I'm not sure how much penalty is associated with that, but everything is accumulating. So the debt burden is growing, even if debt service is at a standstill. So somewhere down the road, it will add that much more pressure on Zambia in terms of fiscal pressure to start dismantling that debt. So it's a challenging situation. But then again, on the other side, I would still go back to the aspect of China. With its exposure globally, you would understand why China would like to be as cautious, as sure as possible about not overexposing itself to contagion. So whatever happens in Zambia is likely to happen in Ghana in terms of negotiation, is likely to happen in Sri Lanka, is likely to happen in many other parts of the country. Now, can China absorb the debt restructuring, the haircuts, and so on that are associated with that type of contagion if everybody asks China to undertake haircuts? So that's a big question that China would have to be a bit cautious about as they negotiate with Zambia.
All right, let's leave China out of it now and look within. Zambia's Ministry of Finance said that it it is urgently needing some sort of significant reduction in terms of his debt burden. So as sides talks with international lenders, and of course the role that IMF is playing within the context, are there any internal mechanism that you think Zambia can employ to address the issue of restructuring the process and even easing the debt burden?
Yeah, I think Zambia is making some pretty strong moves already in that direction. Like I said earlier, I think the team at the Ministry of Finance is very strong and inspires a lot of confidence. They've already put together for 2023 a plan to dismantle domestic arrears. And they've actually put this plan in the public domain. They've been publishing debt figures and so on, just to keep the public aware and up to date with what is going on. And that dismantling plan for domestic arrears is trying to, within 2022, reduce the overall debt burden by starting to service the arrears. These are delays on payments of goods and service providers, in different utilities, in different government agencies and ministries and so on. And the amount is quite significant. It's close to probably about $4 billion that in kwacha equivalent that the government is trying to reduce in 2023. This includes, a big part of this includes the debt that is sitting on our power utility, ZESCO. And even internally, ZESCO is making some significant moves to try and improve the efficiency, reduce the so-called insolvency of that company. So I think there's a lot that can be done, and many of the right moves are already being done, particularly on the domestic front.
All right, so finally, before I let you go, Caesar, earlier this month, the finance minister said that it was hopeful and optimistic that the debt restructuring would be agreed upon by the end of March. But this is March. March is gone. So that means that there's been some sort of not meeting up with that particular deadline. So is there any other time frame that we are looking at, and how feasible do you think that will be now? Because earlier on, you talked about the fact that debts keep piling up, and interests on these debts will always continue to weigh on what the Zambian government would have to pay.
Well, thinking on behalf of the minister, I think like any other leader of an economy on the economic front, he has to try and be as optimistic as possible. I think at the time the minister was making that pronouncement, with the information on hand that he had, he was confident that that would happen. But like I was saying earlier on, new information comes to the table and changes the dynamic of negotiation. So the full negotiation is not something that you can very easily predict. And when new information presents itself, it changes the nature of the negotiation. So now I'm sure with the new information based on consultations bilaterally with China, consultations with other players, the official bilateral creditors, with the Eurobond holders, things are changing and the timeline has to be changed. As far as I'm aware, a new timeline has not been announced, which is understandable because I think the different negotiations that are running in parallel in different pockets have to now be weighed and counterbalanced to see what is realistic.
All right, thank you so much, Caesar. We see that time is taken for Zambia, but then we hope that all stakeholders can come to the table as quickly as possible to put an end to this, or to complete the restructuring process, as it were, so that Zambia can get a bit of reprieve. We appreciate your presence, Caesar, on the show.
Sure, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Now, the International Monetary Fund is in talks with Zambian authorities about how best to support the country, but its help would depend on Zambia taking steps to make sure its debt is sustainable. Bondholders must now accept a significant debt write-down, according to what we know. Otherwise, the African country might end up in a dire strait, and we hope that will not be Zambia's case.